Gwinnett County Public Library for this Meet the Author series discussion. My name is Denise Oder, and I'm with the Gwinnett County Public Library Adult Services Department. And tonight we are hosting activist and poet Kaitlin Curtice in conversation with Dr. Luke Ryan. Caitlin's new book is Native Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. Let me first introduce our moderator, Dr. Luke Ryan. He is a 19th century American history expert and a member of the faculty at Georgia Gwinnett College. He has received research grants from Kansas City Historical Society, Newberry Library, Huntington Library, and American Philosophical Society. His current book project focuses on the lives of several Native American people who negotiated removal, the opening of Kansas, and the Civil War, leaving lasting legacies that would affect U.S. Indian policy and tribal survival. Kaitlin Curtice is a poet, author, and a renowned public speaker. As an enrolled person or citizen of the Potawatomi Nation and someone who has grown up in the Christian faith, she writes about the intersection of Indigenous spirituality, faith in everyday life, and the decolonization within the church. Her new book, Native Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God, is about identity, soul searching, and being on that never-ending journey of finding ourselves and finding God. We welcome Dr. Luke to interview our author.
Hey there. Yes, thank you, Denise. Let us go to our author tonight and have her explain a little bit more about what she wanted to do in writing this book and what her book is about in her own words. So Kaitlin, take it away.
Thank you. So I always like to begin my speaking events with reading a poem from my book. If you haven't read my book yet, in each of the parts of the book, I put an original poem, and I did that just to kind of have, to me, it was like taking a breath right before you dig into, some hard conversations and difficult stories, beautiful stories, but a lot of this book was hard to write. So I always like to read a poem just to kind of let us settle into the moment in the conversation. So this is a poem from Native. Every now and then, we should hear the coffee mug clank as we set it back down on the glass tabletop, because there is nothing to distract us from its presence. We should listen for the creaking beams of an old house whose bones ache with a kind of architectural osteoporosis. We should listen for her groans because they remind us that history lives. And more often than not, the hummingbirds should get our full attention because they teach us what it means to gulp the nectar of life. They teach us to remember that we too are small, thirsty things, looking for the river to drink from, or at least a refreshing fountain. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the journey of releasing this book into the world. So it came out in May of 2020. So it came out as COVID was happening, and it was a crazy time because day to day it was like, will the book even get printed? Are our printing houses staying open? Are our publishing houses staying open right now? It was stressful. And what was so beautiful about this is my book, Native, is guided by our Potawatomi flood story. And so you have cultures all over the world who have their own flood stories, right? And I grew up, of course, in the church. And so I heard about the Genesis flood story, and so I learned about this flood story in our culture. And I thought that it was so beautiful, this idea of, the earth being flooded. And then at some point, something is being recreated again. The earth becomes itself again, right? And I realize that is like the perfect metaphor for what we're finding ourselves in right now, that we're kind of in a flood. We're in this time when everything has been changed. Everything seems different and is different. And we're kind of at this moment in time where we get to dream of a new world. We get to dream of what is next. And that's what I have seen kind of come forward in this book, in this time that it has been released in. And I'm so grateful. It was a hard book to write. It's about my life, right? So it's very visceral. And it required a lot of care for myself. It required being in therapy and processing these things as I'm writing them. And, being an Indigenous woman and within Christianity, trying to just constantly navigate some of the stress of that. And but it was deeply liberating to write it as well. And I've been really grateful for the people who have reached out to me and told me what it meant to them, and so that's been a lot to me. So I'd like to just read a little bit. This is from page 24 of the book, and it's about this section called Beginnings, and it's sort of just about it's in a chapter called Creation Stories, and it's about what do our creation stories mean to us, and how do we sort of belong to each other. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. If we are responsible to and for one another, that means we are called to ask questions and to seek together and to remain tethered all the while. The task of a tribal religion, if such a religion can be said to have a task, is to determine the proper relationship that the people of the tribe must have with other living things, and to develop the self-discipline within the tribal community so that man acts harmoniously with other creatures. This statement from Vine Deloria Jr. in his book, God is Red, explains a great deal of the disconnect between Indigenous belief and American Christianity as we see it today, and as we have seen it throughout history. The original roots of a connectedness to creation that we find even in the New Testament, like the story of Jesus healing a blind man with spit and dirt, are lost on us in America today. We baptize people by manipulating them into faith communities in warm water in our sanctuaries because we do not understand that water is life and that she is our guide. We do not care for this earth, and so as the earth speaks to us with warning signs such as climate change, we don't know how to respond because we don't even see Mother Earth as a living, breathing being that we can learn from. Indigenous peoples are labeled idol worshippers and animists because we have an understanding with the earth and the creatures around us that so much of the white Western church has lost. So how do non-Native people find a way to understand these roots, like the ways that St. Francis engaged with, honored and understood the creatures around him? The answer is in the way we choose to value and care for Mother Earth. And if we truly care for her, we will honor the creation stories of all cultures, and we will do the work necessary to change things, decentering white supremacy as a threat to sustainability along the way. So there's a little bit of what I write about, kind of coming to, the themes of my own identity, the themes of what I've learned within Christianity and how that has caused a disconnect for me, and sort of finding my way back again. And I think it's so funny because a lot of times people will comment on how I help the reader ask a lot of questions in this book, but I'm not always giving you the answer. And I did that on purpose because I can't give everyone the answer to all the questions, but what I want to do is help people ask questions in the first place. And so it's been just such an honor over the last year and a half, I guess now, to journey with people in that way. So I'm really excited to be here. So, yeah.
All right. So yeah, I find your book incredibly moving in that you are negotiating your own identity like a lot of people, and a lot of Indigenous people as well. And I've come to know many Native people my time and living both in Arizona and Oklahoma during the last 15 or so years. And negotiating one's identity, it seems like you're really negotiating your way into new understandings about where you want to be in life.
Yeah.
So I have a series of questions about your book. I have even more going on in my head, but certainly I have some prepared that I'd like to ask you a little bit more about tonight, because they really speak to a little bit about this, about finding Indigenous identity. I mean, you find reminders of your Indigenous identity, not just simply in like an oral tradition or Potawatomi tribal tradition per se,
Mm-hmm.
but actually in varied books and places
Mm-hmm.
that you've come across.
Yeah.
And you talk about several of these books and
Yeah.
you quote several, of course, different scholars related to this search that you're on. What book really inspired you to be proud to be Indigenous, I guess, beyond Vine Deloria's God is Red?
Yeah.
So what book really inspired you? Um,
That's a great question. And what I do love about the time that we're living in right now is that beyond my own tribe and my own people, I feel like social media and some of these networks that we have created and that we're able to create online even has given me such a gift of getting to know Indigenous people from all sorts of tribes and communities and reading their books and trading books. And, it's just been really beautiful. So I'll share a few books that have meant a lot to me and books that I'm still reading and still processing. I think one book, which she happens to be Potawatomi, but this book is gorgeous, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wallkimmer. And Robin is from my tribe. But I started reading her book before I was writing mine, and it just grounded me. Like, it helped me to know that there are storytellers out there who are writing in really gorgeous ways these deep truths, and that I can be the storyteller I want to be, and I can write these deep truths even when it's hard to say the things I need to say. And she just gave me a lot of courage. And like you said, I filled my book with other authors because the last thing I want is someone to just read my book and think that, like, well, Kaitlin said it, so there it is. I wanted people to go to the back of my book and find all these other authors they could draw from. These are two books that have come out this year. I think they're both this year. Ladder to the Light by Bishop Stephen Charleston is just a beautiful book of reflections and short essays. And then this one is really important. The Land is Not Empty by Sarah Augustine is about the doctrine of discovery, which is a really important part of our history that a lot of us don't talk about, especially within the church. And so this book has been really incredible. I endorsed it, and I'm so proud to keep endorsing it because Sarah is just coming to this really important conversation. And as an Indigenous woman, that gives me more courage to keep talking about these things. And then I can't not mention this book, I Am Woman by Lee Miracle. She passed on recently. And so just drawing from Indigenous women that I know and I don't know, but I know that are out there doing this work and who've been doing this work long before I started doing it, has given me a lot of courage. And meeting other, especially Indigenous women authors, and knowing that I get to support them in their work, just being able to pass that on means a lot to me. So.
Okay, so we're going to have some time in just a little while for general audience questions, but we're going to continue in the same vein. Yeah, gosh, I want to say it's back in the early 2000s. I was at Cherokee National Holiday, and for 2 summers, if Cherokee National Holiday is always during what Americans call Labor Day.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always very hot, like 105 in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, when they host this fair, and it's an assortment of many things. It's a coming together, of course, of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, but there's all kinds of different activities. There are, of course, kind of traditional games like Cherokee marbles,
Yeah.
playing stick game, playing very traditional games, but also modern stuff. They have a softball tournament. They also have a powwow that plays to other tribes in Oklahoma. Although Cherokees aren't a traditional, you might say, grass dancing powwow tribe. They invite everybody in. They also have a stomp dance of their own with their own traditions.
Yeah.
And they, of course, have a political address.
Yeah.
And so, interestingly enough, for 2 years in a row, I went with my family, and we went down to in both times, Wilma Mainkiller who was principal chief for a long time of the Cherokee Nation, a very well-known woman who was about to have her likeness put on, I believe, the dollar. I'm not sure. She was really the leading the Cherokee Nation into the future during the critical time of the 80s and 90s, when they both enlarged in their own population, but also really their presence as a self-governing nation once again. And she's a out there person. Like, people knew who she was by the two, right? She's the principal chief, or she just had been. But she was not afraid to go up to anybody and talk to them. Any comer, whether Cherokee or not, whoever you were there. And she really took on this role of welcoming people, no matter who you were. And she had this way about her, which I think sometimes we're missing in Native America, given what's happened, given the politics of varied things, of trying to reclaim our lands and sovereignty and all these, right? What's really interesting about her is, and of course she wrote about this, she published her own a story about her own finding her own self, which your book reminded me of, because she was raised and grew up in California and came back to take a part of her tribal nation. It was a calling for her. And she talks a lot about that and finding her way and finding her role. It's not as if she just found it instantly when she turned 35. It's like turned it on. She went through a whole travail. So why I tell part of that story is because I think my interpretation, in knowing many different Native people, but also Wilma Mankeller, who I used to know before she passed, was the finding is actually a part of a true identity for many Native people. And it is something that is part of what's been, and why, and in some ways why we celebrate Native American History Month, is because it's good for many people to learn what has had to be overcome.
Yes.
Right. We can talk about, give our textbook paragraph explanation of the Cherokee removal, or of other people's removals, or war, or what we call dispossession. We can simplify it very quickly, but the realities of it over time, and also particularly in the present, are important to try to understand beyond the texts that we read. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that leads me in. Sorry, that was kind of a long-winded way to move into my next question. I'm a historian and a storyteller myself, so we're long-winded.
Yes. Well, I will say real quick about that, that there are so many of us as Indigenous people who are reconnecting. That's what we call it. And, many of us didn't grow up knowing our language, and that's not because of us. It's because of colonization and assimilation, these things that are forced on us that have broken apart our families and our cultures. And so there's a great, there's a great grieving, but also this resilience and this struggle to hold on and to learn who we are. And you're right, that journey in and of itself is a whole thing. And it's hard to explain that to people who are not Native, or explain that to people who don't quite understand that. It is its own phenomenon completely. And it's hard to put into words, but we try our best. So, yeah.
All right. So kind of moving down related to my comment there, let me follow up with another question. Your book's obviously in part about finding yourself, but also it's about resistance to the processes of settler colonialism and erasure. These are key words in Native American Indigenous studies today, and in history. What book or work of poetry might you suggest for a non-Indian audience to better understand these terms and come to grips with them?
Okay. So as far as a book that, sorry, let me find it. I'm right by all my books. Let me see. Let me go grab it real quick. Oh man, where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay. So I have a friend, Nick Estes, has written a few books. So this one is called Our History is the Future. And then there's another one. This is an organization that Nick helps run. It's called Red Nation Rising: From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation. This book especially is a newer one, and it will be a difficult read if you're non-native, because it's critiquing America. It's critiquing these systems that we have created to disenfranchise Black people and Indigenous people and the poor. And so it's about a lot of these systems we have created, but they do a really great job of explaining why these systems are here based on settler colonialism. So I've learned a lot from Nick. And then as far as poetry, of course, Joy Harjo, who is incredible. And this is called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings. And, poetry is its own thing that you may not understand what a certain poem is about, but you can lean into what the essence of it is saying. And so even if you're non-native, I think it's still really important for non-native people to read Indigenous poetry. These are essays, but I love his writing so much. Richard Wagamise, who passed on a few years back, is a First Nations writer from Canada, and it's called One Story, One Song. And these are essays, and they're really gorgeous. And I've really enjoyed reading his stuff. So those are a few. I'd really recommend Nick Estes, though. And Nick is a historian, and so he studies history. He lives it, right? But he also can explain those systems really well. And I didn't grow up knowing what settler colonialism is. I never heard that term growing up referring to America. And I don't think most children do. And so I think it is important for us as adults to unlearn and to learn some of these things, because we're not taught them in school. We're just not, and that, I think that's a problem. And so there's a lot for us to learn, and that's not a shaming thing. We just have a lot to learn, and that's okay.
Well, I know that when I grew up in Kansas City in the 1970s and 80s. And I went to a private parochial school for the most part. And I think for a lot of people over the last several generations, there is we're either lacking education, or we're wondering what education we're lacking, right?
Yeah.
Given things that have happened, things like the Standing Rock pipeline protest that happened, the No DAPL protest that happened, that was in the news for over a year, in the national news, in a major event that brought Native Americans and resistance back into the national story, right? Yes. But beyond that, beyond those moments where we're reminded in the news of Native Americans, I think a lot of us wonder about what has been erased. And on page 159 of your book, you say, it's difficult to imagine our cities as something other than what they are. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to think of them without buildings, streets, or storefronts. But if we can remember that they were once lands inhabited by indigenous peoples, many cultures who stood on this ground and acknowledged the sacredness of the hills, mountains, and waters, many people who still do, maybe we can remember that this land is still sacred, that it is still space that we should inhabit while honoring it and the people who care for it. And for you, this was what was going back to Lake Michigan was about for you. Mm-hmm. And I think that both for indigenous people, certainly, but also I think even non-indigenous people, right? Everyday Americans, I think a lot of people think about what was here before.
Yeah.
What this landscape I'm living in once looked like.
Right.
How it's different, and where are we now?
Right.
And in some ways, I think that passage that you have here and talking about you becoming in touch with this place of your historic ancestors touches a lot of us, indigenous and non-indigenous.
Yeah.
Because isn't that something we should wonder about.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and I write too, in some part of the book, I write about how as Indigenous people, we're sort of trapped in time. Like we're trapped in those Westerns that we used to see on television. So it's like we're wondering what was, but we're picturing the frontier sort of, right? Like that kind of grand landscape. And we're picturing what was displayed. So we're picturing the cowboys and the Indians, we're picturing these savage natives or whatever that have now disappeared. And so it's a very strange, because that's what we've been taught is like, well, where are the Native Americans now? We don't know where they are, unless you live near an Indigenous community and know that they're there. A lot of schools, a lot of children are taught that we existed in the Thanksgiving story, we existed in certain ways, but then we're just dissipated somehow. And so to try to like live in this moment and say we're still here doing the things we do, trying to care for the land and the waters, and yet can we reimagine what we've been taught as what was before as well? And it's a tricky thing to do, but I appreciate the people who do step into that. And right, anybody, please, everyone do it. Like that's I've often said, like, it's not just Native folks who should be caring for the earth. Like we all belong to the earth. That's why we're here. We're here to steward that relationship. It's a beautiful relationship. Like people all over the world have these sacred moments with the earth, and that's how it should be. Like we should be doing it together.
Well, when you say that, that's a really interesting point that you make, both from what you just said, but also in your book, is that is actually the part of the process of decolonization. Mm-hmm. Part of decolonization for all of us, is to actually think about and try to better understand the land that was, the people that were here, but also link them to our present, linking all of that to our present, and trying to understand that, learn stories about that actually is real, everyday person decolonization.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that I really was touched by that in several passages in your book.
Thank you.
All right. So changing gears just a little bit, we're going to make it a little lighter since we're here towards the holiday season. I also remember in your book, that you talked about getting in touch with other things Native, like cooking.
Yeah.
And you started to learn how to make Native dishes. So what's your favorite Native dish to make, or possibly maybe make around the holidays?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to share a link for everyone into the chat. I think I can share it to everybody. Let's see. Panelists and attendees. There we go. Okay. I actually just wrote about this, so that's why I'm sharing this link. I wrote about wild rice. And so a few years ago, again, I grew up on government commodity foods. So, we were poor growing up, and I ate, cheese and these like government cheese and canned goods. And I don't know how to describe what commodity foods are, but a lot of Indigenous people are given these commodity foods that are meant to not spoil, right? They're meant to last a long time. Anyway, definitely didn't grow up with our traditional foods and had no idea what that even would mean. And so learning about wild rice, which is a really sacred food for us, that back in our own cultural stories years and years and years ago, as our people were sort of migrating to the Great Lakes region, we were told to look for food that grows on water, and that was the wild rice. And so today I order my rice from Honor the Earth, which is an Ojibwa organization in Minnesota who harvests pipeline-free wild rice. So they're harvesting from the water that's, at least for now, is pipeline-free, and they've been fighting for this water to remain untainted by pipelines and by oil. And so I order my wild rice from them every year. And a few years ago, it was the first time I made this Potawatomi berry wild rice dish. And it's basically just, you cook the wild rice with a bunch of berries in it, and then you add maple syrup and some salt, and then you eat it like that. So you just, it all just kind of simmers together, and it's a really good, like, textured dish, right? It's got sweetness and saltiness, and then with the leftovers, I put on top of waffles. And so which sounds odd, but is so good. And so I eat that with some more syrup drizzled on. So that has become a holiday staple that I make every year. And I really enjoy that. And I'm learning, just trying to slowly incorporate like one or two other books of Indigenous recipes each year, and just to cook a few things, just to try them and see what sticks and what doesn't. But they're just, gorgeous wild rice dishes, and so many berries that you can incorporate, and corn, and it's just really beautiful to like, and that's, I encourage people, you don't have to stop celebrating Thanksgiving. You don't have to stop celebrating Christmas when you decolonize. But can we tell the truth? And then can we like somehow also learn to celebrate Indigenous cultures as well? And that's a wonderful way to do it. Honor us by putting your money toward an organization like Honor the Earth, ordering wild rice, making this dish, and like tell the story about what wild rice means to the Potawatomi people. Like I would love it if people did that in their homes. And it certainly means a lot to me to be able to share that with my children. So yeah, thanks for that question.
All right, so I'll have to think about, yes, berries and wild rice as an add-on, either this Thanksgiving or Christmas. All right, so let's another question. You talk a lot about, you intertwine your search in some ways for both your Christian as well as your Native identity. And you talk in one moment in the book about you were drawn to celebrate your wedding anniversary with your partner by getting a tattoo. Yeah. And a Canadian Potawatomi artist, I believe, named Chief Ladybird, and her work. And you decided to get a tattoo based off her work. Why did this Indigenous tattoo artist affect you? What was?
Okay, let me show you the tattoo first, because it's a little more faded now. But so there's the tattoo, and it's like a sun, and then it's got these flowers that represent the 7 generations, which is kind of the story of our people. So Chief Ladybird and I have, we sort of followed each other on social media. So what I was saying about that, social media has given us this really amazing tool to connect with Indigenous people all over the world, right? But across Turtle Island. And so I started following her, and one day, well, we were like a day away from getting our tattoos, and I didn't know what I was going to get. I just knew I wanted one. And I was on her Instagram page, and I saw this, and I was like, that's what I want. I just knew, like, if I'm going to get one, the 7 generations, like, that is my story. That is a story that means something to me, and the design was gorgeous. And so I messaged her and asked if it was okay if I could get it, because I wanted to get that permission to put that on my body. And so she said yes, and it was really, really meaningful for me. And then Chief Ladybird designed my cover. So this art on the cover of my book is also hers. And so she did the turtle and the muskrat from our story, and there's a sage plant growing up. And then that same sun is reflected in my tattoo. So it's really beautiful, because these flowers and this sun, like, there's some similarities to my tattoo, and that just drew it all together. I am so like blessed by this cover. I love it so much, and I couldn't imagine my book being designed by anybody else. So yeah, and we've remained friends, and I'm just so grateful for her work, and that I get to have this, this thing on my body for a long time that just reminds me of who I am. I think that's a powerful thing about tattoos, that we can choose these really meaningful symbols or pieces of art, and get them on our bodies. So yeah.
Well, I also think what's interesting about that, and I think this may be a word to other people out there thinking about getting tattoos, is there's a lot of great art out there, and some of it looks Native American.
Oh, sure.
However, the art itself is not produced by Native Americans, right? So again, it's interesting, that you had it verified. This was an artist that you got to know. This
Yeah.
was her drawing. She told you
And
her
ask permission.
interpretation of
Yeah.
what it meant. This is not simply,
No, it's not.
right,
Right.
some kind of basic or repeat type of image that you might see in mass culture. That's really interesting. And word to the wise, look for Native artists doing Native work,
Yeah.
both, right? Whether you're going out to an art gallery, whether you want to go pursue real Indian art at Santa Fe Indian Art Market every August, the largest of its kind in the world, whether you're going to go down the street to seek out a new tattoo, make sure you look
Yeah.
into what is really being created and by who. That's a part of decolonizing, according to some of my Native artist friends as well.
Yes.
It's going to what they would say the real source.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
All right. So, and then finally, and we're going to go to turn to some of your questions by the audience here in just a few minutes. I have one more for you. It's a little different than those last several questions. One of the things you also say and bring up that I know a number of Native studies scholars talk about it quite a bit is the Cherokee grandma complex.
Mm-hmm.
When you meet somebody out of the blue, invariably somebody once in a while says, "Oh, you're Indian. Oh, I'm part Indian. My great grandmother was a Cherokee." Sometimes they used to say princess. I don't know if they're still saying
people
that.
Still do.
My great grandmother, I found out, was a Cherokee princess, and that's the reply to you saying that you are a native.
Yeah.
So, what is this Cherokee grandma complex, and what do you do about it?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I have friends who study this specific thing, and so I know that my answer is not even nearly as thorough as theirs. But my friend Daniel Heath Justice, he was a Cherokee, is from the U.S. Has done work on this, so you could look up Daniel Heath Justice. He's incredible. So I grew up in Oklahoma, and it was kind of like everyone's just native. Like that was a very typical kind of response to things. Because like there's so many tribes here, so everyone's probably native, right? And so it's really interesting because it's hard because I'm not going to sift apart somebody's personal life. But also I know that is a story that we tell. I don't know if it's like, there's this interesting thing that's, that people who are not native, this white grandma thing, that it's like they want to have a piece of a culture to belong to a culture, but yet don't want all the other things that come with what it means to belong to an indigenous culture. So I think it's that like, what it appears to be, that it's like, oh, I could belong to something. And so maybe those stories just get passed down. Now there's also the whole other problem of like, and I see it all the time, where you like show a picture of an ancestor and they're like, oh, look at those cheekbones. And I had people say that to me when I was young. You have high cheekbones. You must be native, or, like, and so basing things on these facial characteristics, or, things like that, which denies a lot of people who don't look like, we don't all look the same, right? We don't all have the high cheekbones. And so there are these stereotypes that have been passed down. And then there's this, I don't know, this complex that has been created where people want to be a part of something, and people even, check the Native American box on their college applications. And because, and again, it's just this thing of telling the truth. Like they have been taught these stories, and so they're like, I guess we are, right? These stories have been passed from parents and grandparents, and so it's like, sure, we are, like we must be. But there's no connection to anyone. Now that's different than someone reconnecting, and so that is different. And I want to make that clear, that someone who is trying to reconnect to their people, in Canada, we have people who were forced out of their families, like who were adopted out, and they don't have a choice, right? And so their descendants, their kids, their grandkids are trying to find their way back again. There are things that have happened that have caused so much harm to families. So someone reconnecting is different than someone just being like, oh, sure, I have a Native in my family somewhere, right? So what I see today, the DNA tests and a lot of these things are really popular. And I think that at the core of that is just people wanting to feel like they belong to a people or they belong to a story, right? And that's not a bad thing to want that connection. But what can happen is that sometimes we can then take that and it becomes a, a problematic way of examining our own story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's definitely a litany of scholars who have worked on blood and identity, the social construction of Native American identity. There's plenty of work out there that the audience certainly could go, and it's got its really own life, its own.
It does.
American Identity Studies has its own literature. A lot of work has been done on it, so certainly. Yeah, but the thing I would say too about this issue, and I have known people, and personally, I have Indian ancestors, and I am a non-enrolled person, so I've negotiated this for many years.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with claiming your own ancestral family history, as long as you're not projecting it as something else.
Yes.
You can be a perfectly willing ally with Native American people. You don't have to be. You can claim your ancestor and still be Mr. Joe, who is pro-Native or knows people, is in touch with people, or their issues and their, right? You don't have to necessarily claim an identity to actually be kindred in some ways. So I think that's important.
When people do that, it's not helpful. And I understand people think it is, but just be you and let's just do the work together.
Yes, I would say that's kind of where I think my point was going. Yeah. Well, those are some of the questions I have here about your book. I didn't, I could ask you a lot more. I know that you have a Christian faith minister background. I did not get into that. I'm going to we'll see what the audience says. Certainly for some readers that they might find that quite fascinating too. We didn't quite hit on that here. Yeah. But certainly there's some other issues that raised by the book. And so I'm going to go over here real quick to the chat and look up and see if we have any questions about people have put up tonight. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So this is kind of related to my last question, and Tina Samuels has put this question in the chat. And it's related to finding her own identity. Mm-hmm. She is seeking out she's from South Georgia, she says, where her family were born, except for her mother. Mm-hmm. She's attempting to identify her tribal background of some of her ancestors. And after doing some research, it seems that her family is part Creek or Cherokee. Mm-hmm. Where would you direct me to go for this information?
Yeah.
She knows that, and from what she's been told, she is of Native and Black American ancestry. Yeah. And so she's kind of wondering, I guess, on a journey to find out more about her ancestry.
Yeah. I get asked this a lot, and it's always hard because it's such a personal journey to try to figure that out. This is learning, because I'm listening as well. What I have been told from other people who are scholars on this or who are doing things is to try to connect to a specific community and see what they can do to help you. So, find out maybe if there's I don't know if it's called a band, but what specific community is nearest to you or near where your family would have been, and connect with someone there and see what they have. A lot of tribes have history and have things on record, right? Like I can go to my tribe and I can see things. Not all tribes do, and that's part of colonization as well. So I would go and try to connect with the tribe there. Yeah, Tina said in Georgia after the Trail of Tears, it was illegal to be Native in Georgia. Yeah, I mean in Georgia history, there's so much going on there. So I would say to find a way to connect with a secretary or someone who's with one of the tribal headquarters in that area, and
Right.
talk to them and explain that, and then see if they can help you work through some of your records or some of the DNA stuff or whatever you have found. That's my advice. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good advice, because I think, in what you're saying is, and what's important for some people to understand is, Native American nations are their own sovereign nations.
Yeah.
They determine their own membership.
Yeah.
Now, those may be two different issues. You may just be seeking more about your family tree.
Yeah.
Other people are actually seeking out linking their tribal ancestors to a contemporary Native American sovereign nation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are two different issues based on what you're searching for.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, there are the Porch Creek in Alabama, the Creek Nation in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
There are also the Eastern Band Cherokee, North Carolina, the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, among other entities. You could go to their websites or to their tribal enrollment officers and simply give them a call.
That's what I would start
Because
with.
they can give you, that's what they basically do. Full time.
And they're helpful, right? They're trying to help you figure that out. So
right. Yes.
Yeah, that's I think a first step for Tina.
Yeah. I mean, again, and if you do know some of your ancestors, the easiest way to build a family tree is to go to ancestry.com.
Yeah.
My mother's family, you can very easily build out your family tree if you just have some information. That might be able to help assist you. However, again, linked to Native Americans, you're going to have to look beyond maybe some basic records. All right, Tina. Well, I guess we answered together. We answered Tina's.
I hope so.
So that's good. We're looking for any other questions you might have about Kaitlin Curtice's book, Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God.
Oh, Denise asked what my next book is. Oh, okay. So I am working on my third book right now, and it'll come out in 2023, and it is on everyday resistance. And so it's a book about, beyond just decolonizing work, which is what I write about a lot in Native. How do we just, what are the ways so on the micro level in our everyday lives, but then also on that macro level of protests and the things that we do as communities, how do we resist hate? How do we resist the status quo of what we've been given, at least in America, but also in the world? And so I'm writing a book about that. And it's kind of, to me, a book of solidarity work. I'm trying to draw from things that have happened in history, things that are happening today, and also paying attention to my own story, right? And weave that in, but also wanting to just have this conversation about what resistance is. So that's my next book. I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed in your book that you are interested in linking past events, and some might say traumas, to finding yourself, or what this means to you more in the present. What do these past events that happened to the Potawatomi mean to you in your life story in the present?
Yeah.
And I think not only is that a very powerful Indigenous seeking, but I think it's a seeking for a lot of people in general. Some of the best works I've written about the Holocaust by the next generation of survivors, right? The survivors' next generation. Yeah. And I'm thinking, geez, about, and it's just kind of about going back and finding out about the past, but also about how the past is related to you. And I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. I've both read the book and it's Frosh, seen the movie as well that was made, where he goes back to Ukraine and finds out where his family was killed in the Holocaust. Really, Holocaust studies has got some great books about this. Yeah. So in other words, it goes to many people go back and look at what do these events mean to both people of the past, but to us now.
Right.
and who we are now.
Right. Well, and I don't even think, as you know, being human is so complex. And I don't think, even for myself, for a lot of us, we haven't even connected who we are today to who we were as children. Like, we haven't even looked at our, so not even talking about like back in our own history or the histories that we're looking at as a nation, like even just us as a person. Like, have we even taken the time to like connect to ourselves as children to heal some of those things, or to know ourselves better through either trauma or whatever it was that happened in our childhood, little traumas or big traumas, right? But I think that we even don't even look at that. And it's so much that we can learn just from our own journey, and then once we go beyond that, we're learning about the journey of others. And that's where solidarity work happens. So I'll write about that more in my next book.
Right.
I don't know if you have any more questions. That may be it. How about I end with one more poem?
That would be great.
Let's do that. I'll read a poem about, since we talked a lot about ancestry, I have a poem that I wrote to an ancestor. So this is a poem that I wrote to someone who's passed on. It wasn't to any particular person. It's just to my ancestors. Passed on one, I see you there. Not your skin and bones, nor the frame that once held you. I see your aura, your spirit, your essence. I see the glow of who you once were and who you are today. I see somehow the imprint of what you've left me here. It's not a thumbprint, but some other form of spirit code. Somehow the shape of you carves lines into the essence of who I am. Somehow I am enough because you were enough. Ancestor, your name will always be the sound of breath in my lungs. Ancestor, your face will always look like the face of my own children. Ancestor, your essence will always feel like the wind when it slips through the tree branches singing a song. You, dear one, lead me still. I feel the gifts you've left me, and I wonder how much more is waiting. I learn my own way as I reckon with your mistakes and realize that you were human once, like I am human now. I wonder how much you notice from the other side. What does God feel like? I'll wait, and one day you'll show me. Thank you.
That was a beautiful way to end tonight's program. Thank you. Just lovely. And many, many thanks to Dr. Luke Ryan of Georgia Gwinnett College for joining us tonight and leading a very excellent program and discussion about the book. And thank you, of course, to Kaitlin for coming to us from very cold Philadelphia, I bet, here. We miss you in Georgia, and we look forward to that book next year. Thank you.
Thank you.